Are you trying to establish your brand as a thought leader? Start a podcast, invite industry experts to be guests on your show, and watch your brand become the prime resource for decision makers in your industry. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. This is another episode in our How to Podcast series. I am Logan Lyles, Director of Partnerships here at Sweetfish Media. I am joined today by James Carberry, the founder of Sweetfish. James, how you doing, man?
I am a wonderful dude and super fired up to be talking about this idea of figuring out how to get guests on your show.
Yeah, I love it. So those of you who have tuned in to the How to Podcast series, we're breaking down lessons we've learned and things that we're testing and trying out in over 800 episodes on our show here, B2B Growth, as well as launching and producing dozens of shows for our clients. So today we're going to be talking about some insanely creative ways you can use to get guests for your podcast. So something that we think about a lot with this show and for our client shows. And James, you're going to unpack a couple of things, and we're both involved with this as we find guests for B2B Growth and think about how we handle this part of producing a podcast for our clients. And you said something really interesting as we were chatting offline before we hit record here, and that was think of getting guests on your show like you do prospecting. Tell me a little bit more about that, man.
Yeah, so I think when you really understand the true power of podcasting, which is what we've been shouting from the rooftops ever since we started this business, you hear it on every ad spot in this show. It's all about building relationships with people that can either refer business to you, buy from you, or otherwise bring some sort of benefit to your business. So it is not about the mass, acquiring masses of listeners. It is more about building one-to-one relationships with your guests, because it's those relationships that are ultimately going to propel your business forward. So when you think about finding guests for your show, you're not just looking for people that can share quality content. Obviously, that's a given. I see a lot of podcasters that just want to find like authors of books, but most oftentimes a book author isn't in the business of hiring you for your service or buying your software. And so, yeah, the book author has great content, but that relationship with that author isn't going to be nearly as valuable to you as if you were to form a relationship with a director of operations at a 75-person company that has a need for the software that you sell or the service that you sell. So instead of going after those quote unquote thought leaders that have written books and speak on stages, week after week, figuring out who is the decision maker for your product or service, and then how can I get that person to be a guest on our show? So as we're talking through these list of ideas, I want that to be how our listeners today are thinking about it. Because it's not always just a no-brainer. Just because you ask someone to be on your show, they're super busy. And if they work at a big company, there's lots of PR. There's a PR nightmare that you got to go through tons of red tape internally to get approved for something like that. So we're going to be talking about some things that I think are very similar to either account-based marketing, which is that direct mail, like super customized approach, or just kind of regular sales prospecting. But we're just talking about it in terms of how do you do that type of activity to get people on your show? Because once someone's on your show, you've now got a legitimate relationship with them, and your likelihood of selling to them at some point or working with them in some capacity at some point is going to rise significantly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, people have been doing, direct mail is kind of rising again. What's old is new again. Some people refer to it as contact marketing, like our friend Stu Heineck. So let's talk about some of those pieces, some physical pieces that folks could use to send to prospective guests on their podcast that could entice them in ways that they could kind of frame that around their show. Let's talk about a couple of those. You mentioned before, as we've been talking, James, bobbleheads and caricatures.
Yeah, so super creative. You can find somebody to do a caricature drawing. You can take the LinkedIn photo of a potential guest for your show, take their LinkedIn photo, send it to a caricature artist on Fiverr for $5 or $10, and have them do a caricature. Fiverr.com is a good place for that. You can also go to Upwork.com. Really, really affordable. You can have them draw a digital version of that caricature, and then you can print it out and maybe on some nicer paper and send it to the person that you're trying to get to be a guest. Bobbleheads are a little bit more expensive. You're going to spend between $150 to $250 to get a good custom bobblehead made. We have done this for people that refer business to us. We send them, we switch it up a bit. We don't just send bobbleheads, but we've gone through that process and it's always incredibly well received. People always post about it on social. It's a bit of a talk trigger when you send someone a custom bobblehead. So if you're sending them a bobblehead and saying, hey, love what you're doing at XYZ Corp, would love to have you as a guest on our show, because you've wowed them with that gift that's so customized to them, the likelihood of them saying yes is going to skyrocket. And then the likelihood of them being willing to talk to you about what you're actually selling is also going to be much higher, or the partnership opportunity that you're presenting to them, whatever. So those are a couple that I love. Cookies are another one. We've tried this with one of our client shows. We didn't see a lot of success with it in particular. I think it's more, though, the market that we were going after, the type of guests we were trying to get. I just think we're extremely hesitant. It's an older demographic, and I think they're just extremely hesitant to do anything kind of public facing. And so cookies didn't work as well for us in terms of getting guests in that one particular use case, but I still think something like cookies could work. Handwritten notes is something we are starting to try more of. We've got somebody that we've added to the team that is focusing on that particular initiative. So handwritten notes. And then another one, and this is for folks, if you're trying to go after like mega thought leaders, like think folks like Pat Flynn or Lewis Howes, Jesse Itzler, people that are extremely influential, hundreds of thousands of followers, if not millions of followers on social. I wouldn't suggest that, and because the likelihood that they end up promoting your content is going to be very minimal, but it's obviously beneficial to have relationships with people at that level. We've got one of our customers that has done a phenomenal job of building those relationships with very influential people. It has not necessarily come back around and helped his bottom line much, but those relationships are, you can't argue that at some point in the future, those relationships are going to be incredibly fruitful, whether that means when he writes a book one day, having all of these friends that have lots of followers to promote that book. There are lots of different ways to capitalize on relationships with those type of people. My fear is that most people just default to trying to become friends with influencers. And the problem with that is everybody's trying to do that. And so it's just really hard to break through that. And there's not much short-term benefit of doing that anyway. So it's, to me, just a misallocation of resources and time trying to do something that is really helpful for our ego. It's nice for me to say, oh, I know such and such because he's got 2 million followers. So you appear to be a big deal because you know him or her. But in actuality, it doesn't actually help your business that much. So I'm just not a huge fan of that. But if you do want to, if you've got a strategic purpose for connecting with those type of people, paying to attend their masterminds and events is a great way to get on their radar. It's obviously going to cost you a lot of money to get in those, but if you are a customer of theirs, they have deep incentive to actually have a relationship with you. And so that's another way to do it. Another thing that you've got to think about, Logan, when you're trying to find guests for your show, anyone that wants to be a guest on a podcast or is up for being a guest on a podcast, typically they care about their personal brand. And so when you look at that and go, okay, if people that are going to be on our show, potential buyers that are going to be on our show, they don't have to have a huge focus on their personal brand, but they typically do. That's why they're willing to be a guest on a podcast. And so you look at and see who else cares about their personal brand. What other places are those people hanging out? So you can look at industry conferences. Who are your ideal buyers that are speaking at conferences in your niche or in your industry, in your vertical? Go after those folks. Say, hey, I saw that you were speaking at this event on this particular topic. Would love for you to do that same talk, but for our podcast. Are you up for it? One, you're going after people that have already developed content, so they don't need to come up with a new idea. They're just now looking for additional reach. So it's great for them. But if that person is someone you can actually do business with, it's great for you too, because now you're building a relationship and a very personalized approach saying, hey, I saw you were speaking at this conference on this topic. I think that'd be great for our audience. What do you think? They're likely going to say, yes, we've had phenomenal success with that. And then the other thing is looking for guests that have been on other podcasts that are talking about similar things to what you're talking about. It's clearly they've already indicated that they're willing to be on a podcast or they wouldn't have been on the other one. And it adds a level of personalization for you to say, hey, I heard you on this podcast. I think you'd be great on ours. You could even talk about a similar topic. Are you up for it? And so all that to say, lots of different things to think about there, but those hopefully are some very practical and actionable things that folks can do to recruit guests for their podcast.
Yeah. And I think something you touched on there could even tie to something you touched on earlier. If you send them a handwritten note or maybe something in a frame that is maybe quoting them on that other podcast that you heard them. So you can take that personalization, maybe if the email reaching out saying, hey, I heard you say this, I really liked what you said about this on that podcast. If that email doesn't work, then maybe send them a piece and use that personalization in that and combine those two. We've had good luck too approaching speakers at conferences, especially before they speak at that conference, because then they get a chance to share a little bit of that content and then promote, hey, I'm going to be speaking at this conference at this time, this date. And so speakers at conferences will definitely jump on that. And we've also used it as a way to get time with speakers at conferences that we want to get in front of by saying, hey, I'm going to be at the conference. Would you mind sharing some of the content from your talk in a podcast interview while I'm on site? It can be an effective way to make use of those time to make sure that you're building those connections with potential podcast guests while you're going to those events that you're attending anyway. So hopefully this has been helpful for folks. Wanted to share some of our lessons in getting guests on your podcast and some creative, thoughtful, just a little bit different ways that you can go about it, and keeping in mind, again, who are your ideal guests. If you have any other ideas for this series in How to Podcast, definitely reach out to me. I'm Logan at sweetfishmedia.com, or feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. James, anything else you want to add, man?
No, man, the one little thing that we have done, I say little, it's been huge for us. If you are like, let's say you're in HR and you're selling to HR professionals and you have a podcast about some element of HR, go find a list. There's a ton of them curated by a bunch of different big industry publications, like best places to work. So like look at Glassdoor and find their top 100 places to work. Go to those people, the HR, your buyer at those companies, and say, hey, I see you made it on Glassdoor's top 100 places to work. Would love to have you on our podcast to talk about that topic. For us, we talk to really fast growing companies. So there are a ton of fast growing lists. There's a ton of them to pull from. And so we go to those, top 100 fastest growing startups that LinkedIn just did, or, there's a ton of different ones, but going and finding those lists and prospecting based on those lists, again, adds another level of personalization. They don't feel like you're just reaching out to everyone. You're saying, no, I saw that you were on this list. Would love to have you share your story on our show. That has worked incredibly well. So I don't want to drag on too much longer here, but that's definitely been something that has been extremely helpful for us.
Yeah. I love it, man. Well, James, thanks for joining me in yet another series here on B2B Growth. And hopefully this was helpful for folks that are thinking about or in the midst of producing a podcast and trying to find guests for their show. Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. All those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.